Welcome back, folks, to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live, broadcasting from the City of Angels or City of Demons, depending upon who you ask. And we are internationally syndicated, lots of affiliates globally, starting with our hometown network of UPRN, the United Public Radio Network, 107.7 FM, New Orleans, Louisiana. And like I said, there are lots of affiliates, including people in Hong Kong, that carry the show. Another one of the affiliates that literally followed me to UPRN is Deprogrammed Radio Network in the United Kingdom. They also cover areas of the EU, and they also have terrestrial affiliates in London and Leeds. Plus, iHeartMedia. Got to give a shout out to them since I have not mentioned them lately, but they are literally carrying the show, and we do have to give them a shout out. Now, lots of times we do bring you two guests per show, and tonight is one of those nights. Two fantastic guests. The second part of the show, we're going to be hearing another report from the World Affairs expert, or World Affairs, I guess you want to say, the person that Alex Jones uses for talking about world affairs. He is the #1 contributor for Alex Jones' show, InfoWars. But before we get to Joel Skousen, returning Joel Skousen, we have for the first time joining us a Forbes.com contributor. He literally has been talking about mainstream science, particularly space, for quite some time. He's a fantastic guest, and I gotta say, you folks are in for a treat hearing him tonight. And just the time I had about reading about him, his article, and having a chance to chat with him before we came on air a little over an hour ago, I got to say I know that I'm very excited to bring him on and very excited to hear what he's got to say, like I said, as you folks will. So now that I've given you enough time to check out our website, social media, and anywhere else we've promoted through the show, well, it's time to introduce our guest. As I mentioned, he is a journalist, technically a contributor, and an author, Mr. Dorminey. Bruce Dorminey, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I hope I can live up to your introduction there. Very nice. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. You know you can. I mean, your resume is literally filled with a lot of fantastic things. I mean, for instance, you've interviewed Nobel Prize winners, I'm assuming for physics, I would think, right? Is that what they were, the Nobel Prize?
That's right, yeah.
And being affiliated.
Also for astronomy as well. I mean, astrophysics, yeah.
And the fact that you work for Forbes.com as a contributor is phenomenal. Not very many people can say that they do work or their articles are published on Forbes.com. So just to make it that far, Bruce, I have to say is phenomenal. I mean, my hat's off to you, dear friend. So speaking of articles, let's go to your article that you just released about funding, the space funding, the lottery, the space lottery. First, let's talk, just tell us what the article's about for those people who don't know or haven't read it. And of course, while you're mentioning it, might as well plug in where it is in case people want to follow along as you talk about it.
Yeah, it's at Forbes. It's my latest article for Forbes, which I just published in the wee hours East Coast time last night. And it's basically, everyone knows that states have lotteries, and some of them have weekly lotteries, and then I don't know how many states. I saw some figures yesterday, but several dozen, and who actually have lotteries, and a portion of those proceeds from the lottery, of course, they have to pay, use the ticket lottery sales, to fund the proceeds to pay out, and also administrative fees. But a significant portion of a lot of those state lotteries goes towards education and other causes, worthy causes. And so I got to thinking, I've personally been very frustrated with the funding situation, not only for NASA, but just for worthy astronomical and astrobiology efforts that lack funding. Even great telescopes that have been in existence for maybe 100 years are still in use, but they need new instruments. And for literally $100,000 or $200,000, they can revamp their instruments and do great science. And so these lotteries are generating lots of, cash every week, and a portion of that, I think,
huge
goes
money,
to help.
actually, yeah.
Exactly. So that's a long answer, but I mean, a portion of that can go towards funding some of this basic space and science research, and maybe even for funding new rovers. I'm not naive to think, we could fund a trip to Mars, but, you could help fund research that might facilitate a trip to Mars. There you go.
Let me ask you, this is a question that I've always wondered. Do you have an idea why the U.S. government decided not to fund NASA the way it did 50 years ago, 45 years ago, instead of allowing companies like SpaceX to deliver astronauts to the International Space Station, or even to put payloads into space like satellites?
Well, the Apollo program was really a Cold War effort to get there, to beat the Soviets, to land on the moon and beat the Soviets walking on the moon. I mean, that's pretty well accepted. Yes. And the International Space Station was basically at the end of the Cold War, after the Soviet Union fell. It was an effort started by President Reagan, late President Reagan, to, basically do a joint effort with the Russians to make sure, this is, kind of controversial, but to make sure that their scientists were occupied on peaceful efforts instead of something that would cause trouble. And so that was a joint international effort with the Russians, and then, of course, the Europeans signed on, and it ballooned from an $8 billion project to $100 billion. That space station, probably in 1995 terms, in 1995 dollars, is worth $100 billion. And I know, I got that from the head of one of the top spokespeople at NASA headquarters years ago for an article I did. That's a lot of money. Now think about Apollo, which only, was funded to the tune of, the whole program was only $27 billion. Wow. Of course, that was the 1960s. I don't have a calculator in front of me I don't have that. But, basically, the Apollo was about, beating the Russians, the Soviets rather, landing on the moon and doing all that. And the space station was, I argue that it was largely, to make sure that we were cooperating in space instead of, going after each other in space. And the space station has done some good research. I personally would not have elected to spend $100 billion that way. There might have been other things I would have done with it, but that's all hindsight, and that's politics.
You watched the very first, and this is the 50th anniversary, July 1969, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin took off on Apollo 11 and landed on the moon. You actually watched that, didn't you?
Absolutely. I was in a Sunday night. My dad came home from a deacon's meeting at our local church and said, "Hey, I'm skipping this deacon's meeting. I'm going to watch this, and I want everybody, we were glued to the television anyway. I was a space junkie back, before I was even 10 years old, and I don't know how old you are, but
39. Most people, not old enough for that. Okay. That's for sure. Yeah.
It was great. I mean, it's one of those moments that, cliche, but you never forget.
Oh, absolutely. Any of my friends and family who were alive at that time said it's just like JFK. They remember exactly where they were, what they were doing when man walked on the moon. And it didn't matter what nation you were from. This was a thing that you were proud to be a human being. It didn't matter if you were living in at the time the Soviet Union or in Greece or Australia. You knew this was a giant step for humanity. And I think that's the impression that I get from people that recount to me, the joy that they felt that particular day. Like you said, it was a Sunday in July. I think it was July 20th, to be exact, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't have that in front of me. I think you may be correct. But I thought Neil Armstrong's statement, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, yeah, brilliant. And I assume that was his own wording, but you know.
It was actually. I did read my own little, about that, and I ironically, apparently, even because he wasn't in the public spotlight after that, and I was wondering why. Truthfully, I always thought he'd been dead until 2012 when he actually did pass away. But I did know that he had been practicing what he wanted to say for quite some time, and he said the wrong word, which ended up being more accepted. I think he meant to say one small step for. I know he didn't mean one step for man. It was, and then one giant step for mankind, or one giant leap for mankind. It had something to do with a little tiny error with one small step. But regardless, like you said, a very, very brilliant statement. Now let me ask you this. This is, of course, pure speculation, and I've just wondered why for so long. Why have we not, meaning America, because China is finally taking steps to get there, why have we not returned to the moon since Apollo 17?
I think it was basically President Nixon decided that, and let's be honest, the mainstream public was losing interest in watching, these live shots from the moon. I mean, I'm not, they just didn't seem to be quite as interested at the end of the series of missions as they were. But I don't know. I don't have an explanation except that we won the Cold War. We won that Cold War battle. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, absolutely,
and,
absolutely.
And I think that was it. Now, there are conspiracy theorists who say we were warned off the moon by aliens lurking in a crater and this kind of thing. I really don't think that's the case. But I do think, I was going to mention this, I do think, and I've done an article on this, and I mentioned it a couple of times, that I do think we need to be looking for alien artifacts on the moon. I'm not saying recently, but I'm not saying that from aliens who may have been there recently, but there's a fellow named, an astrophysicist named Paul Davies, very well respected, who is a professor at Arizona State University, who published a couple of papers, on why we should be doing surveys for alien artifacts on the moon. I even did a Forbes piece on this. And it basically posits that aliens, who were, surveying their sector of the galaxy, maybe even robotically, would have sent probes into our inner solar system. And the moon is a good spot to look because it has no air. There's a very little exosphere. And so whatever they sent may be, sticking up a foot or so from the lunar regula, and may have been preserved. And now on Earth, as you know, we had the pyramids, but they were only, 10,000 years old. We're talking about an artifact on the moon that may have been preserved for 10 million years. 10 million year old technology, which is what Paul Davies says he thinks we should be doing a survey. So, I mean, there you go. That's probably the most controversial thing I'll say today.
Well, still, you actually answered what my next question would have been, which would have been, why should we focus our efforts on putting rovers on the moon and looking at the moon more closely? And that's a fantastic answer. And I really would think that, like you said, especially by having no air, no atmosphere to decay the way something on Earth would decay, if we were to find artifacts on the moon, even if they were 10 million years old, they would be in far more pristine condition than, say, if they were here on Earth for even 500 years or 1,000 years. I think that would be such a dramatic difference that it's worth the effort to try to look. What do you say about the rovers on Mars?
Well, let me just say one other thing though about the moon before we move on. Remember that Arthur C. Clarke's 2001 was based on an alien monolith,
yes,
which was activated, which was buried beneath the lunar surface, and it was so Arthur C. Clarke, one of science fiction's greatest contributors, came up with this idea in the late 50s, I think. It was called the Sentinel, if I'm not mistaken. And it's a valid idea. I think, I'm not saying it's likely, but it's within the realm of possibility that if aliens themselves have not visited our solar system, it's certainly within the possibility that they've sent probes, robotic probes that could, maybe travel faster than light, I hope, or maybe not. Maybe they're generational probes that somehow repair themselves over eons and eons of travel through the interstellar medium. And, let's face it, you mentioned Kepler just off the air, the Kepler Space Telescope just off the air. And, within 10 years' time, we're going to have a pretty good idea of who's out there, what planets are out there that can support life. We already have a pretty good time. Within 10 years' time, we're going to get, real-time pictures of an extrasolar Earth orbiting a nearby star. And we're going to, we're going to know who's out there. And, we're going to know, we're looking, there's an effort now to look for technosignatures, alien technosignatures. You've heard about Tabby's star and all that. So I think this is going to continue. We even had Avi Loeb, the Harvard University head of the astronomy department at Harvard, who posed the idea that the Oumuamua asteroid or whatever it is may have been an alien sail, an alien solar sail. And he even posited that maybe these FRBs that people are fast radio bursts that have been tracked by radio observatories are power plants that somehow power these alien solar sails. I personally don't. I think it's a natural object, to be honest. But he raises an interesting point that even if aliens haven't visited us in our distant past, that they may be sending probes that are detectable.
And, one thing that's always puzzled me, meaning this is only a handful of years ago, the star system that seemed to show this, and I'm going to come back to the Mars in a second. Is it the boson Dyson or boson Dixon? Do you know what I'm talking about? That where it's a possibility that the star that we're looking at, the way it's reflecting toward us, that they theorize that it is possibly something that's created to encompass their star to be used for power. Did I get that correctly?
The Dyson sphere. Yeah.
Thank you.
That would be a type 2 or 3 Kardashev civilization. Kardashev was a Soviet physicist who ranked potential alien civilizations in terms of how much power they could harness. And so we're not quite yet a 1. And a 2 is a civilization that can harness the whole energy of their star. And that's a Dyson sphere. Now, why you want to do that, I don't know. And then a type 3 Kardashev civilization, if memory serves me, is one that can harness either multiple stars or even the energy from, a small galaxy.
Or the black hole is what I remember reading about.
Or also could create black holes. Yeah, you may be right on that. So I don't know. I mean, or could create their own wormholes, for instance. But I think that's. I think we have been looking. There have been surveys looking for Dyson spheres. I've written an article or two about that, and the first couple of surveys came up null. But there was hope that Tabby's star, this enigmatic star that has a bizarre light curve, and there's still debate about that. I personally think it's probably a natural phenomenon that we just don't know. Most of these things end up being natural phenomena. For instance, the pulsars. The first time we heard of pulsars, they were actually Jocelyn Bell Burnell, this is all in my book, who I interviewed, and she finally was awarded the Nobel Prize quite several decades after her work. But she's the lady who discovered pulsars, and the fact that pulsars emit this strange whumping sound in the radio spectrum that at first glance looks wholly unnatural. In other words, it looks artificial. And the advisors were so concerned about this leaking to the public before they figured out what exactly it was, that the first two signals that they were able to detect, they actually labeled them Little Green Men 1 and Little Green Men 2.
Interesting.
LGM 1, LGM 2. And now, of course, we know they're wholly natural. They're fast rotating white dwarfs that are spinning at at high rates of speed and emitting these magnetic pulses that we detect.
Space is full of sounds. I remember watching a documentary on the different sounds that are emitted from space, and what people, like you just mentioned, at one point labeled these pulsar sounds as Little Green Men 1 and 2, thought there was a whole array of different sounds, whether it be the rings of Saturn to another star, and just Earth itself emanates so many different sounds naturally, let alone what we send out artificially in terms of radio waves. But I know if we point our telescopes in pretty much any direction, you will receive some sort of sound that may sound unnatural, but doesn't really have any patterns to it outside of being just what a regular loop would be for a natural pattern. And so you could probably comment, I would think, on how many different sounds, and I think that people, if they really paid attention to sound, say for a decade or longer, would really probably get used to hearing something and not jumping out of their seat like, oh, I found something that is non-terrestrial.
Well, the thing that you have to realize is that these quote-unquote sounds that we're talking about are not heard in space, because space is a vacuum, and so there's no air to carry anything. But the sounds that they convert to sound signals are converted from the radio or whatever spectrum into sound, and so it's not an actual sound in the way someone yells down a hallway or something like that. It's converted into a signal that we can interpret as a sound, if that makes sense. I think I'm correct about that, because obviously there's no atmosphere in the vacuum of space to carry sound.
Back to Mars.
Okay, back to Mars. Anyway, so what about Mars?
Well, I wanted to ask rovers on Mars, yes, because we have the face, what people interpret to be as a face, because I know different passes of the telescopes around there have shown with more light that, well, maybe it's just natural curvatures, but there are things like anomalies that, pyramids, for example, that I'm just wondering, is it something that could be naturally created because there is no atmosphere or nothing that could sustain life there? Yet 100 years ago, I believe humanity thought that, well, maybe that's where our space brothers and sisters live, until they started to realize, well, hold on a second, we've looked enough and there's nothing there to be excited about.
Well, the face on Mars has been proven I think it's pretty well accepted now that it is just a natural phenomena. And I'm not saying that just because I'm trying to be a skeptic, but I'm just saying that because that's what I truly believe. As far as pyramids on Mars, I've never seen any evidence for that. Maybe you could point me towards that. I'm not. And in terms of Mars's atmosphere, it has about a 2%, 1% atmosphere, largely carbon dioxide. And you do. I just did a story on this InSight lander, which heard an infrasound, which is probably a meteor coming into Mars' atmosphere. The interesting thing about Mars, it has global dust storms, which can interfere with the operation of the rovers, because a 40 mile per hour wind on Mars is about the atmosphere on Mars is about a tenth of what we have here. The effect would be But if you had a 40 mile per hour wind, the way it was explained to me, you would feel about a 4 mile per hour breeze. Okay, and so if you get, I don't know the top speed for dust devils or the wind on Mars, but let's say for argument's sake, 70, 80 miles, 8 miles an hour wind could, stir things up a little bit.
Oh, I would absolutely think so, especially with the rovers primarily using power from solar power. And if they have these global dust storms, I would imagine that scientists here would probably have to worry that some of these panels on these rovers could get easily destroyed. At least that's what I would think on face value.
Yeah, I mean, they do they can interfere with the instruments. They can move rocks around that could interfere with the rover itself. But let me get back to the funding issue again, both for the moon and Mars, for the rover situation. That we didn't really touch on. You mentioned looking for alien artifacts or ancient alien technology on the moon. Yeah, I support that. But I think there's another reason to go back to the moon with rovers and, try to cover pretty much every nook and cranny from the surface, because there are only 12 people have walked on the moon. 12 astronauts have walked on the moon.
That's right.
And they've only covered about 100 square kilometers at most. And the size of the moon, the surface area, is equal to the surface area of North and South America. Now, so you think about it. If you had sent 12 people, or if you had stopped exploring North America and South America after only sending the Explorer Discovery to the western United States, and you came back and you reported to President Jefferson, yes, sir, we scoped it out, that's it, no need to send anybody else, let's wait another 60 years. That would have been, think about it, 1806, the first Explorer Discovery, Lewis and Clark, 60 years, 1866, after the telegraph was in operation, technology had evolved, but he had no interest in finding out what the rest of our continent was about, much less South America. So that's just nuts. It's nuts to me, because this could be, you could explore every nook and cranny on the moon with rovers. You could send $100 million rovers. If you produce them in mass, you could probably send 20 or 30 or maybe even 50, and in pretty short order, maybe it would take a couple of decades, you could quantitatively explore every nook and cranny on the moon. Now, of course, we have the Lunar Reconnaissance Rover that's been wonderful and has taken great spectra, but we really need to get back to the moon, and here's why. Our existence may be because we were struck by a Mars-sized impactor which formed the moon. And our moon helps stabilize Earth's obliquity so that we don't have such seasonal variations, which could cause, which could lead to problems in the evolution of life. And I know evolution is a dirty word to a lot of people, but so be it. Anyway, there's still science, great science, that needs to be done on our nearest planetary neighbor. And there's also no reason why we shouldn't be, sending at least 2 to 3 rover missions every 2 years to take advantage of the Hohmann transfer, the time when the Earth and Mars are at their closest approach, and be launching at least 2 probes to Mars, and whether they be orbital or surface or rovers, 2 or 3. We can afford that, and humanity can afford that. And the reason I wrote this article about funding some of this research using a lottery is people play the lottery. They're going to continue to play the lottery.
That's right.
Maybe morally don't agree with it, fine. People are going to continue to drink. Prohibition proved that people will drink no matter if you outlaw alcohol. The lottery, if you consider the lottery a vice, so be it. But there's no reason if you don't have a space lottery, people are still going to walk into a 7-Eleven and do a scratch off, and they're going to do it every day, and they're going to do it every week, and you're not going to change that by not having a space lottery. So you might as well take advantage of a great way to raise real cash to help fund some of this research.
I absolutely think that it could be used because, like as you mentioned, such a good portion does go to education. I mean, I believe they only, I know half of the whatever the jackpot is available for the winners, but and let's just say someone does win. If they choose the cash option, they only get 40%. That other 60% obviously goes to the different areas that the lottery funds, and so why not fund space? I personally would love to see NASA get a nice influx of money. That way we're not relying on these corporations, because one thing I could tell you from legal point of view, a corporation does not have to tell us what it finds or what it does. I mean, it's not a civilian-based government agency, whereas it's a for-profit corporation, so their mandates may be so completely different that I think it is important for us that we do have this funding. I gotta say, Bruce, it's been phenomenal to talk to you. Any other points you want to mention before? I know you said you couldn't.
Yeah, I do. I actually do want to mention a couple of points. I don't want to pick on Jeff Bezos or the billionaires, and I think Bezos is doing wonderful things with Blue Origin. I think Bezos' proposed lunar lander is great, and I think his reusable rockets and his line of rocketry is fantastic. But I think he spends $1 billion a year on his Blue Origin research, and I honestly don't know how to commercialize it. The whole big problem is commercializing space, which I think is why we have to look at alternate funding. And but not to pick on Bezos or Bill Gates or
Bigelow
like
or Elon Musk, yeah.
Exactly. I don't know how deep the Musk's pockets are, but I know that from reading about his divorce problems, that Mr. Bezos is he could easily spend $10 billion to set up a lunar colony.
Yes.
And
yes.
And he wouldn't even feel it. It'd be like a tip to him. I mean, what is $1 billion? What is $5 billion?
When you have 70 after the divorce, it's really nothing, considering he's going to keep making that money. Amazon was founded as a company to keep losing money for enough time to where you dominate the market, and now they're at the point where every year the profits for Amazon are going to be so high, they're only going to get bigger.
And there are two last points I want to make before we get off. And number one is, we need to be doing, a Congress just can't be relied on. I mean, Washington is a mess. I don't care which side of the spectrum you're on. And we've heard this catchphrase, back to the moon and on to Mars at least 3 times in the last 25 years. Every president does it. Even President Obama brought it up as, we're, the vision thing. They get into their last 2 years of office, and they're worried about their historical legacy, and so they trot out the moon and Mars. Oh, great. But it never happens. And with funding cycles that run every 2 years, and Congress can't even come up with a budget half the time, they shut the government down, or whoever you want to blame for the shutdowns didn't start with President Trump. They actually started during the Clinton administration, if I'm not incorrect. And so Washington, D.C. is a basket case. Our political situation is a basket case. I don't care if you're as far left as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or if you're extraordinarily far right. It doesn't work. And so for humanity and for our space future, we have to think outside the box about how to fund this stuff. We can no longer rely on congressional funding completely, and we can no longer rely on the largesse of these space barons. And, it's obviously I'm passionate about that, and I offer no apology. But if you took $3 to $5 million, if I had $3 to $5 million and I could vote to one area of research, which I think would be worthwhile, that would be in circumventing Einstein's theory of relativity, so that we could go, have a warp drive. And there's a 1994 equation from a prominent Mexican theoretical physicist that offers a way to do that. Now, what we need are people who are in front of computers or chalkboards or in conferences. You need to hire, a couple of dozen theoretical physicists to do nothing but run in shifts, like the Manhattan Project. And within 10 years, their goal would be to come up with a viable warp drive. Run them like a factory,
Is this what CERN is doing, you think?
Not to my knowledge. Where'd you get that idea?
I always heard that that's what they were smashing. They were smashing atoms together to try to create a wormhole. That's just at least what I've heard. That's why I was asking you.
That was no. They were actually looking for fundamental particles, new fundamental particles, particularly the fundamental particles that explains the concept of mass. I mean, that was a God particle, and I assume they found it. As far as they're intentionally trying to create wormholes, no. I think that's a bad way to go. I think we need to instead support the work of the Tau Zero Foundation. I don't know what the status is for them. We also need to support the work of people like Mark Millis, who I've interviewed several times, who's a brilliant theoretical physicist. He headed up NASA's Breakthrough Propulsion Program at NASA's Glenn Research Center in Cleveland, and his whole budget, get this, I think he did it for like 3 or 4 years. His whole budget for that time was at $1.7 million plus his salary, whatever that was.
It doesn't get you very far. Honestly, it doesn't get you very far at all.
But he was able to investigate 8 to 10 concepts and vet them. And as you know, you work in radio. You get a lot of people coming to you with wild ideas about propulsion technology. I get it myself, and some of it needs to be vetted. Some of it needs to be investigated. But basically, we need serious, well-trained theoretical physicists who agree to work at a reasonable pace, basically 24 hours a day, on how to circumvent the speed of light. And if we did that, it'd be amazing, and at a very small cost compared to our gross domestic product.
Finding a way for faster than light travel, Bruce, I have to say, we have to try to find a way for it, like you said, to find a way to circumvent it, because if you try to travel at the speed of light, the only way you're going to get anywhere is by these self-healing robots or that duplicate themselves, or probes like that. Because if something is, say, 100 light years away, our generation is going to be gone. There ain't going to be anybody who sent something from now living at that time. So like you said, we do have to devote this, and I'm surprised why it's not happening in the public and why it's being held back, unless it's because of the political mess that you mentioned.
Well, if you went to any member of Congress and you said, hey, how about some funding for circumventing the speed of light, they would look at you like you were from Mars. I mean, think about it.
They would actually spend the money on something else. That's what I've already gotten the impression, is you can't really rely on them for much. And that's I'm glad you mentioned the fact that you really can't get much done from them because of all the I don't want to say hogwash, but the fighting and what you did mention about the shutdown starting with the Clinton era. If I'm not mistaken, I believe you are correct. I don't recall it at the time happening before, and that's why it was made such a huge deal when it happened, because it's like, well, how can the U.S. government be shut down at the federal level? And so now for it to be being repeated is a very scary thought, considering what if you have these theoretical physicists working 24/7? would a shutdown literally stop them in their tracks? Well, what does that do for humanity moving forward? It stops us.
That's why. That's why you need a space lottery to be able to fund that, so they don't have to rely on a fickle Congress or politics or some politician, decreeing that we need to go here or there or yonder, And anyway, that's I probably have said too much about that, but I do think that our infrastructure is crumbling. We need tunnels and bridges and interstate highways, and that's definite, and new hospitals and new schools. But if we lose sight of our destiny, our manifest destiny, the voyage through space, in my opinion, both robotically and in spaceships, I think we lose sight of who we are, because we are nationally curious. Now, why? I don't know, but we are.
And that is the final frontier.
And exactly. And when you deny our curiosity, you are basically killing the human spirit.
Agreed. And especially since there's so much exploring to do. As I mentioned before we came on air, even with the Hubble telescope, when they would point it in one direction, and as you pointed out, that the Hubble telescope was not meant to find these exoplanets, but now when the Kepler telescope points at a direction, they find clusters and stars that they never thought. So there is so much more to be looked at than we thought 20 years ago, 50 years ago when we were on the moon. And I think it's only going to keep growing every single year, and that's why I would like to see this funding. And I hope somebody listening or somebody who has the power to take some sort of lottery money out there does something, Bruce, because you're really onto something there, and I got to say my hat's off to you for that. And so much work you've done.
Thank you so much for having me. I just want to mention people can follow my articles on Forbes.com, and just Google Forbes.com and Bruce Dorminey, Dorminey. They can also follow me on Facebook. I have a public page. Actually, I have two public pages. One is Bruce Dorminey, picture there, me with a camel, a couple of camels, and then there's a public page for my book, Distant Wanderers: The Search for Planets Beyond the Solar System, which is almost a couple of decades old now, but it's still a good introduction. And sadly, although we made great progress, a lot of the questions that it raises are still unanswered. And so I still recommend the book. I think it's a pretty good read. It got good reviews, and it'll give you a nice background on the whole subject of astrobiology and exobiology and extrasolar planets. And it's written for people. It's not written as a book that you just pick up, and it's not a beach book, put it like that. But you can pick it up and not know anything at all about astronomy, and by the end of it, you know a great deal, and you know a fair amount about exoplanets. And so I appreciate the opportunity. And I'm also on Twitter, B. Dorminey or Bruce Dorminey.
And like you mentioned, people can find you on Forbes, and we do have your links in your bio on our website. So, Bruce, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I do know you do have an upcoming trip, and I do wish you well. And I hope when we come back next time with you, coming back on our show, we could talk more about these exoplanets, especially the so-called Goldilocks planets that we seem to be finding all the time.
Well, thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to and the freedom to say, to speak freely about this. This is, we don't have these kind of debates in the mainstream media as much as we should, I don't think. And I think, there should be I would like to see more mainstream public forums on radio and television about this sort of thing. I mean, the public is interested, but we need to be having these debates, because there's a whole generation that didn't grow up with Apollo, and I think anyone who did is passionate about space.
Agreed.
So there you go.
Agreed. Well said, Bruce. And again, thanks again for joining us. The honor is definitely ours for having you. And as I mentioned before the show, you were the guest of honor. So by all means, the freedom is absolutely there for anything you've said. And that's why I wish you well when you come back to say anything you want to say then for the same reasons, because we all are interested. I mean, that would be a lie to even suggest that we're not. And yeah, I can't wait just to see where we are in 10 years, because technology changes so fast. Applying that same technology growth to searching for exoplanets and learning more about astrobiology, I think there's just so much to learn. Anyhow, thanks again for joining us, and we will move on to our next guest. So I wish you well.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
The honor is all ours. Thanks again. Now, we are getting ready to have some world affairs briefs, folks, as we move on to our next guest. First, let me give some shout outs first. I got Lars Saturn. I want to thank you again for joining on the chat in YouTube, but also for contributing in the super chat. Welcome to the Monkey House. Agreed, Lars. Thanks again, Lars. You are very much appreciated. Let me give some more shout outs here that have been paying attention here. I understand you guys have heard some crackling, and that was the connection with our guest from being on a mobile phone. But hey, it's better that we had him than not have him. And we cover all sorts of topics. Doesn't mean I necessarily agree with all the guests, what they have to say, or disagree with all the guests they have to say, but I always want to give people a forum. And really, this last person, being connected to Forbes, to be a contributor for Forbes, is quite a major feat. Let's see who else we have in the chat that I want to give a shout out to. Pam Brettenberg, my social media manager. Remember, folks, check out our website, unitedtruthseekers.com. Also, Hadley Scott McIntyre, Billy the Kid, Alan A. Nakamura, and as I mentioned, Laura Saturn. I want to thank you one more time. And now, let's move on to get our world affairs expert on. He is a political scientist, also the world affairs expert for Alex Jones on InfoWars. Website, worldaffairsbrief.com. That is something I check all the time. If you guys and gals want real news, please make sure you check out the worldaffairsbrief.com. You can see the banner on our own very website, drjradiolive.com. Click it, it'll take you straight to that. And let's see if our guest is connected with us now. I believe he is on. Mr. Skousen, you with us?
I am. It's good to be with you.
Welcome back. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. And as I was mentioning, or actually, as I think I mentioned to you before we even came onto the show, I did have a chance to speak to your son, Andrew, and I wanted to thank him for being on top, both of you, literally being on top of the news. And I speak honestly here, Joel. When I search for news, my first stop is always World Affairs Brief, because you are on the cutting edge of news that the MSM does not want us to know for lots of reasons. And I think that we are at a tipping point. I know Liz Whelan says that all the time, Wheeler, on One American News, but honestly, that is probably one of the most accurate statements to mention, because I think we're going through more change now globally than we have ever in any period of, say, a couple of years, and what's to come now is even scarier. Now, just alone today, Mr. Skousen, on worldaffairsbrief.com, you have a lot of articles. So if you don't mind, let's first talk about, and then by all means, after what I mentioned first, any article you want to talk about or any news, I'll let you take us there. But I'm going to start with Trump's bad border deal. Can you tell us what's going on with that state of emergency? Because I get the hint that it's not going to happen.
Well, this was the subject of last week's World Affairs Brief, and just to make a minor correction to what you said, worldaffairsbrief.com introduces people to my weekly news analysis service, and we do post some of the better news stories under daily news, but the detailed analysis of what goes on, which is different than posting even good news stories. My detailed analysis is found every Friday at my World Affairs Brief, which is an email subscription-based newsletter, and your listeners can get a free sample copy by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. And so last week, the main issue was the bad border deal that Trump signed. and it's really a problem because when you look at his declaring an emergency to get an additional $3 billion. The deal that he signed gave $1.37 billion, but the problem is that he really Trump undermined his position by signing the deal, and basically he essentially by signing and agreed that with Congress that all he was getting was 1.37. Now, using executive summary or executive powers, he was able to get additional a few billions, about an additional $4 billion by taking the drug forfeiture fund, which he can do, and by diverting funds for the drug interdiction program, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security. And technically, the border is drug interdiction and inhibition. But the problem is that he made a statement in his statement to the public in his news conference that he really didn't have to declare an emergency. He could have got the money other ways. And that's going to be a problem when he goes to court. There's 16 states now, including California, that are suing the Trump administration to stop this emergency declaration. And I'm covering in tomorrow's World Affairs Brief what happens in that legal battle. And I think it's very important to understand that I don't think Trump's going to get good legal advice on this. The basic issue that it's coming down to in terms of the court cases against the Trump administration, the main issue is that he is going to basically, it's an unconstitutional move to bypass Congress. And on the first glance, it does appear that way, that when you don't get your way, you just declare an emergency and get your way anyway. And that's the way that the case is going to be presented to the courts to get it ruled unconstitutional. But it is actually not just the constitutional power of Congress to have the ultimate power of the purse, as the argument is being made, because they technically have to get the president's signature. In other words, Congress provides what they think they want, but the president has to agree. So it is a shared constitutional responsibility. It only becomes the ultimate power of Congress if they get a supermajority to override a spending veto. Now, in addition, the responsibility of the executive on spending surfaces supreme to Congress if Congress fails to pass a budget and raise the debt limit. Then it's up to the president to allocate existing funds as he sees fit to keep the essential functions of government going. So what I'm trying to do is make the case that it isn't cut and dried, that this is strictly the prerogative of Congress. If Congress fails to act, Donald Trump, under both court precedent and general
statute,
government tradition and statute, has the ability to determine where funds are going to go with what. In other words, he has, as the chief executive, the oath of the Constitution to uphold, which is to make sure that people's lives, property, and the defense of the nation carries forth. His prerogative as the chief executive of the country is not diminished if Congress fails to pass enough money. In other words, he has not just an obligation to follow what Congress passes or overrides in his veto, but he has an obligation under the Constitution to protect lives and property. And this is the argument, I think, that would be better for him to put down. This is the legal power that he has under the Constitution. Congress is run, by example, by majority rule. But under the nature of the U.S. Constitution, no majority, no matter how large, can take away or allow by inaction of Congress the destruction of property, rights, or life. So Trump could argue that there's a state of emergency because border landowners' property is being trespassed upon, that owners' property, livestock, and sometimes lives have been threatened by illegal entry, which is true. Trump can also readily make the case that numerous lives of citizens not on the border have been lost at the hands of illegal alien criminals or through the fentanyl opioid crisis. And he has made the latter argument about fentanyl and the opioid crisis, but it needs to broaden to this. He should say, My responsibility to protect the property rights and lives of U.S. citizens supersedes Congress' power of the purse when they fail to fund what I consider the core element of protecting those rights, a physical border along the barrier along the border. He should further say, we've tried electronic surveillance, we've tried enforcement, we've tried deportation for decades, but the increased numbers of illegal entries are overwhelming our efforts and failing to stem the flow. Only a physical barrier will slow the flow enough for other measures to be effective. So I must act now without further delay. Now, you see, I think that's a powerful legal argument for declaring emergency to protect lives and property that are not currently being protected because the border's open. But I don't think we'll ever hear that core argument from his mainstream attorneys that are in the White House.
You just brought up another good point. I'm going to come back to people that are working against him in that. A good friend of mine, during the El Chapo trial, said, why don't we just take the confiscated money that the DEA has from all these cartels, and anytime they arrest a huge trafficker, and fund it that way? It just blows my mind why they're not. What are they doing with these extra funds that they're seized after someone's convicted and the appeals are gone?
Well, they've been used to fund the DEA and other things, and Trump is going to use that. So he is doing that, but it only amounts to some
El Chapo seized.
Or so. No. Chapo's money is not in the United States. His $14 billion is not accessible. It's hidden all around the world. So that's not available.
Yeah, because if he was available, 1/3 of that, or a little bit over 1/3 of that, would have been exactly what he needed. Now, he did bring that figure down from, I believe he originally was seeking $25 billion and now changed it to $5.7 billion, right?
Which is insufficient. And this is what I object to Trump on this. In other words, the danger of dropping it down, give me $5 billion, is that if the Democrats, in which they didn't give it to him, but if they did, they say, okay, we gave you what you wanted and that's all you're going to get, period. The point is, an additional 200 miles of wall or steel barrier fence is not enough to stop the problem. You've got to seal the whole border to effectively stop them from bypassing. I mean, they go around the walls that are there right now. The walls do work. A few of them go over the walls, but most of them travel down and go through the empty portions of Texas. People don't realize that most of Texas has no wall at all. And that's why you've got to have the whole thing or it doesn't become a real deterrent.
It actually, like you mentioned, if you fund or you cover with the barriers, say 95% of it, well, then why wouldn't they just go around the other 5%? Which is something that historically, if you look, correct me if I'm wrong, if this was World War II, when Germany went around France's wall because they didn't cover all of it, if I'm not mistaken, that was the story.
Right. They came through the gap in the Ardennes and poured out into Germany because they didn't think they could get through the woods. They didn't have the Maginot Line there. You're absolutely right. So it's just like any security thing in a house. You know, if you secure the walls and you secure the doors, they're going to go for the windows. And if you're going to secure the windows and the walls, they'll secure the doors and the windows, they'll chop holes in the wall. So you see, it always gives people incentive to go to the weakest link. So you build a partial wall, they go around it. It doesn't cost them a little more transportation, but they go around it. Now, if you had 95% of the wall closed or in effect, you could probably, with Border Patrol and surveillance and cameras, handle the other 5%. And there probably will be certain areas where you can't build a wall because of certain cliffs and other barriers to building a wall. But you can certainly handle that if you've got most of the border covered. But it's got to be at least 95%.
Now, going back to Trump's own cabinet, as you mentioned, the mainstream legal advice that he's getting, and it wasn't until I realized how much of it was corrupted until Roger Stone, in fact, did tell me that a lot of the people that are in the Oval or working with Trump right now actually didn't vote for him. They voted against him. It was sort of shocking to me, but yet, as we're seeing with a lot of these people that have been fired, you look at even Sessions, but yet Sessions' replacement, Barr, is it going to be any better?
No, William Barr is deep state. He was the fix-it man and the Attorney General under George H.W. Bush. He covered up for Iran Gate. He covered up for the Iran-Contra drug importation schemes. He knew about all those things and covered for them. So William Barr is clearly deep state, and, Trump fires one and gets another deep stater because he doesn't know who's who. He talks about draining the swamp, but how can you drain the swamp if you don't know who's who in government? You see, that's the problem of coming from a non-conservative liberal background. And suddenly, through good instincts, and Trump does have good instincts, he sees what needs to be done, but he doesn't have any way to counter the sophisticated arguments of the advisors that he's allowed to staff the White House. Let me give you an example. In tomorrow's World Affairs Brief, I'm covering the fact that the Vice President, Mike Pence, brought in a guy called Mark Short to be the White House staffer in charge of liaison with Congress. So he's to push Trump's legislative agenda with Congress. Well, Mark Short comes from a Koch brothers outfit, and he was anti-Trump. He worked all through 2016 and 2015 to keep Trump from getting the nomination. So he was an anti-Trumper. And so he gets in to be in charge of the legislation, and all of a sudden, he's trying to push through this bill. And, of course, the House Speaker, Mr. Ryan from Wisconsin, who Jeff Renz rightly calls Rat Ryan, kept telling Trump, we don't have the votes to pass wall funding. We don't have the votes, even though you have a Republican-controlled Congress. In fact, he did have the votes. Mark Meadows of the Freedom Caucus said clearly Ryan was lying to the president. They did have the votes. But in addition, and this is the point I'm saying, that Trump's wall got sabotaged within the White House itself. Here was what happened. This happened early last year. In March of 2018, Trump realized his deputy had ignored his demand for a big budget to build the wall. He demanded, and they put in the legislation, he wanted $25 billion to build a wall. So according to the Wall Street Journal, in March of 2018, Congress completed a $1.3 trillion spending package, but it only included $1.6 billion for a border barrier, with most of the money intended replacing existing fencing. That's what Trump's using right now to repair existing fencing. And it banned the money from being spent on any concrete slabs or any other type of wall prototype that the White House was considering. Now, upset that there wasn't money for the wall, or more money for the wall, or any wall really for a true wall, Mr. Trump threatened to veto it. At an emergency meeting of the White House with his staff and Republican leaders, Mr. Trump learned that the spending bill incorporated all of the border wall money that was requested in the White House proposed budget. But it turned out to be $1.6 billion instead of $25. In other words, they were telling him, this bill incorporates everything that we asked them to incorporate, so you should sign it. He said, well, how much for the wall? $1.6 billion. He started to use expletives. Who the blankety blank put in that instead of my request? He shouted, referring to the change from $25 billion down to $1.6 billion. And it became obvious that Mark Short, his legislative affairs director, had in fact made the change without telling Trump.
That's 5%, actually, almost 5% of the actual original price, or the original ask. That's actually, I don't know how you could really work with that, such a budget like that. And as you mentioned, if Congress gives that, or gives whatever the ask is, they'll say, okay, enough's enough. Or you've asked, we gave you, and we're not going to give more. I could see that absolutely happening. And like you said, trying to drain the swamp, yet it's, how is it going to be possible if it is such a humongous mess up there, and you have bad advice, and you have people working against your interests in the executive branch?
In fact, Mark Short was spending most of his time trying to get all the Republicans on board to give amnesty to DACA people as part of that bill. And he was compromising and sacrificing the budget for the wall in order to convince Democrats or to give them anything for the wall as long as he gave them amnesty for DACA. So this was sabotage from there, but ultimately it's Trump's fault. because Trump is like a typical big executive. He just depends on briefing. He doesn't do any homework by himself except for watch Fox News. Of course, Fox News will really never say anything about the real deep state. You know, their version of the deep state is that it's a bunch of Obama holdovers trying to sabotage the Trump administration. The deep state really is deadly. It kills presidents. It does terrorist attacks. It funds ISIS. It does all of these dirty things. It controls the intelligence agencies. They lie to Trump, telling that Assad used chemical weapons on his own civilians, which was patently false. So, you know, it's hard for a president who doesn't know what he's doing, who comes in basically on instincts, and he can get skewered by all of the briefings around him. And this is an example of what happened for the wall when you let Paul Ryan and Mark Short lie to you, and then it's too late. You know, they've worked their deals with the Democrats and got agreement, and Trump, because he unfortunately makes these grandiose statements, we're going to make a deal, it's going to be a beautiful deal, you're all going to love it, then he feels obligated to go through. Then he gets burned, he has buyer's remorse, just like he did on getting talked into staying in Afghanistan and Syria, and then decides, no, I'm going to get out. And so this is the one thing that Trump has done. He's caused such instability within the globalists because he keeps changing his mind. They talk him into one thing and it doesn't stick. Of course, his promises don't stick either, you know. He gets talked out of those. So this is a real problem for us, Donald Trump's lack of stability.
Do you think this is why House Speaker, or former House Speaker at the time, Paul Ryan, did step down? Because of exactly what you just mentioned, the fact that he was lying to the president?
Well, he kind of knew that there wasn't anybody in the White House that was going to contradict Ryan when he told him that he doesn't have the votes to pass wall funding. And Trump wasn't listening to the Freedom Caucus very much. You know, he doesn't have direct contact with them. So he just wasn't getting a contrary view. Everybody was telling him, yeah, Paul, Ryan is right. We don't have the votes to pass it, so we're going to have to compromise and get some Democrats on board. That's what they kept telling you. You got to get some Democrats on board. That means you got to offer amnesty. So it was really a problem.
Let me ask you, you mentioned Assad in Syria. I remember when the mainstream media was showing people affected by chemical weapons, but yet you saw other people during Christmas time happily celebrating, taking their children to take pictures with Santa Claus. And yet these people who were being interviewed said there was no chemical attack. There was nothing that was reported that really happened. How could such a lie be perpetuated for so long?
Well, it's because the media is part of the deep state, and they know the false intelligence, the fake news that they want to present, and they're all completely uniform. And that's what is so convincing to the American people. How could all of these people, be lying, and how could they all be wrong? And remember when the intelligence professionals, all 6 of them, got up before Congress and said, we disagree with Trump, and he's wrong on this, and there was this big outpouring, including a resolution in the Senate, that Trump needs to listen to his professionals and stay in Syria. They say that ISIS isn't defeated. Well, of course ISIS isn't defeated, because the deep state creates ISIS. They just took half of the Syrian rebels and said, you're now ISIS, and gave them priority on funding and training and arms, and sent them on a rampage through Iraq so they could have an excuse, and then turn them around towards Syria so that the deep state could have an excuse to come into Syria again. And of course, Russia intervened and stopped that, and so that was a problem for the deep state. Russia could clearly see that the U.S. wasn't really fighting ISIS, that they created it. They weren't stopping or interdicting any of the oil supplies from ISIS being marketed through Turkey. Caravans of oil trucks lined up at the Turkish border. Finally, the Russians attacked those caravans and said, look at that, the U.S., you're allowing ISIS to sell their oil, and Turkey's doing it for them, supposedly your ally. So they exposed the lie. Well, the U.S. thereafter made one attack on an oil convoy, but dropped leaflets warning the drivers to get out that an attack was coming, so they didn't kill any ISIS truck drivers. But that's the last time the U.S. ever bombed an ISIS convoy. So this is what Trump is up against. He just doesn't know what the deep state is doing.
Let me ask you, because Trump has been publicly saying that the ISIS caliphate has been just about virtually defeated, and they show maps of what it was, I don't know, maybe 2-3 years ago, and it was the size of, I don't even know what the size was, but it took up most of Syria. So at least that's what the mainstream media showed was then, and now they say it's a small portion of it. Do you think what he's being also fed a lie, or we are being fed a lie by the mainstream media of what is really of ISIS still existing in Syria?
Well, yes and no. You've got to remember that in every one of the battles against ISIS, the U.S. let the leaders and a large portion of the troops escape to fight again in another location. So, because the U.S. has been claiming to fight ISIS, and because of the Russians embarrassing the U.S. in exposing the fact that they really weren't fighting ISIS, the U.S. had to get the Iraqis together to attack Mosul and defeat ISIS. Well, they left they didn't surround the city completely. They left the whole sector open so that ISIS fighters could eventually escape. A lot of ISIS people got killed in the process because the Iraqis didn't know that the deep state, the U.S. was backing. Well, I can't say that they didn't know. A lot of the politicians knew because they had film footage of U.S. helicopters coming in and resupplying ISIS beyond the lines in enemy territory. So that made that film was shown, for example, in the Iraqi parliament. Never got shown in the United States, though. That shows how the U.S. is controlled. But in every case, the U.S. always airlifts out the leaders, supposedly in a peace deal to save any more destruction of the city, and they live to fight another day. In the final battle in Raqqa, where ISIS was so-called permanently defeated, the U.S. cut a deal with ISIS that they would do a ceasefire, and they always do this to preserve them, so they don't have to go in and kill them all. And they said, we'll let you go out without your weapons. But in fact, what the U.S. did is paid for about 50 semi-trucks to go into Raqqa and save not only ISIS and their families, but also their heavy weapons. They trucked out, courtesy of U.S. taxpayers, back to rest in Syria. And what happened to them? Well, the media suddenly loses track because they get melded back into the Syrian rebels, where they came from. All the Syrian rebels, there are no moderate rebels, they're all jihadists. And so it's very easy for the U.S. to merge ISIS back in there, and then when Trump decided to pull out of Syria, what did they do? They gave the order, they pulled ISIS back out, and they started attacking again. You see, Trump, ISIS isn't defeated.
You're absolutely right.
So,
recently, they've had a couple more bombs that went off in Syria that they've reported that killed, I think, each time at least a dozen people. And some of them are pretty graphic that they're showing. But like you just said, so if yet we're defeating them, then why are they still able to pull off such bombs? When you mentioned the fact that the United States has been trucking out their weapons, this sort of reminds me of the American Fast and Furious deal where we were supposedly selling weapons to, cartels in Mexico, and we sort of lost track. I know it's not the same scenario here, but yet if you're taking ISIS out in a ceasefire and then bringing them and their families to another area to fight another day and bringing their weapons, well, then you're going to have a permanent enemy and a generational enemy at that.
That's right. And, I've covered in the World Affairs Brief how the U.S. deep state used the Azerbaijani airline to fly in most of the heavy weapons to ISIS, and they did it all under the cover of diplomatic baggage. You're talking about 300 heavy lift airplanes flying diplomatic baggage? Who's going to believe that? You see what I mean? But that's what they do in international law. They just stamp it, diplomatic cargo, and they let it through without inspection. And, a Bulgarian, very courageous woman journalist found out about it, went to Syria, photographed a lot of the U.S. labels on the weapons and things in the warehouses for ISIS, and showing definitively that the U.S. was funding and arming ISIS.
What happened to her? I would have thought that if something like that was to happen, they would have done whatever's possible to keep that not away from us, away from the citizens of the United States and of the world, any of the alliances of the United States.
Well, that's right. She got fired from her job in Bulgaria. That means the U.S. put pressure on the Bulgarian government to fire her, to make sure that she didn't. And she went and worked for another U.S. or not U.S. but another group in another state, and started doing freelancing just to get her word out. And of course, 20th century conservative website put out her total information, and so she had a good outlet in the United States. But unless you saw it on the alternative web, you didn't find out about it. The U.S. arming ISIS. We found that the U.S. has built chemical weapons plants in some of these areas, like in Georgia and other places in Europe, in the former Soviet Union. And boy, I tell you, it's just got armed guards all around these places, and they do biological warfare plants in Eastern Europe and transfer the stuff around the world. So the deep state is really an evil, horrendous, dark side arm of the government, and Trump doesn't have a clue what's going on. Even if he did have a clue, it would still be difficult to find out about, because they control the NSA, they control the CIA, they control the FBI. Who do you get to prosecute them? Who do you get to get the goods on them? Who do you get to tap the telephones to get the goods on who's deep state and who isn't? The NSA, and they're controlled by the deep state, so they're not going to tell the president anything.
Let me ask you about relations with Russia. I read on, and as you mentioned, World Affairs Brief is a subscription, and if people want to read in depth, they could if they sign up for the subscription. But I also did see from worldaffairsbrief.com, let me find it here. It was an article that you had written, or Andrew had written, about Putin to the United States. I'm ready for another Cuban Missile style crisis if you want one. How could we get to this level if during the campaign in 2016 Trump was talking about making a peace with Russia, and then you had that Helsinki summit, and now it looks like we're at odds again with Russia? And I remember the last couple of shows we've done, you talked about the upcoming, what we have to worry about, alliance of Russia and China and an invasion from the east. And so where does that stand now? Where do we stand with I don't want to say Soviets, but the reason that word popped into my head is since Putin was former KGB.
Well, Christopher Story, the late Christopher Story, the only other analyst besides myself that claimed that the fall of the Soviet Union was a carefully crafted deception, calls them the continuing Soviets, and they are. Communism is not dead, it just went underground, and Putin is still a communist. He did purge the original oligarchs that came out and made themselves wealthy during the fall by having the state bank give them loans sufficient that they could buy Gazprom, and they could buy the oil concessions and all of it to make themselves wealthy. And then they were purged by Putin, and new oligarchs were allowed to arise who give to this day a certain cut of their profits, their illegal profits, to Putin, making him probably the most wealthy person in the world.
Yep.
So this is the continuing Soviets, but the communists have always made themselves personally wealthy. The whole thing about the dictatorship of the proletariat is just so much propaganda. But it's a complex thing.
I was just going to say, you mentioned Putin being the richest man. That's absolutely correct. In Forbes, when they list the top 10 richest, you see next to Vladimir Putin, there's an asterisk. And then it says in great detail that although it's estimated he's worth $40 billion, his true assets will never be known, especially since some of the properties he owned, we could only go at face value of what they're actually worth. I believe he is the absolute richest man on earth. Far greater wealth than Jeff Bezos and anybody else, I think, who could afford $1 billion home, and unless you're the leader of a country and have all these missiles. And I don't think he's going to leave the office unless he leaves feet first, meaning dead.
Well, that's the same way it is with China now. Both Putin and Xi Jinping have made themselves dictators for life, unlike Kim Jong-un, and that always takes place before war happens. So these are the main people that are going to start World War III. But let me just go back to your question about why is Russia now the enemy when Trump was trying to make peace with them? Well, it all started, you've got to remember, all during the Cold War years, the establishment, the deep state, was downplaying the Russian threat so that they could justify continuing to give aid and trade to Russia, including military weapons. Henry Kissinger got Nixon to authorize the transfer of miniature ball-bearing technology to Russia so that they could MIRV their missiles. That means get multiple independent warheads that would be accurate and could hit within 100 meters of where they were aimed. They didn't have the machines to do the miniature ball bearings and need to do the precision gyros that it takes to keep a ballistic missile on track after it launches. And we gave them that technology because, we're trying to be friends with Russia. In 1997, Clinton unilaterally said, we're going to keep 50% of our submarines in port at any one time, just to make sure that Russia could more easily target them, as a gesture of goodwill to show that we have no hostile intentions toward Russia. Now, the point is, so I'm making the case that the establishment has always been permissive with Russia, and that includes signing disarmament treaties, even though they knew Russia was cheating. And, why do you sign a disarmament treaty with Russia when you have no treaty with China?
Yeah.
It's like three gunfighters facing off, and the two say, well, let's put down our guns, but the third still has his gun. I mean, it's just stupid to do that. But the point is, when Russia intervened in Syria, suddenly the establishment had to turn against her. They could no longer be permissive because Russia had got their number. He knew that the globalists were faking the war on terror, and they had to demonize Russia, lest Russia expose the entire globalist agenda of creating conflict through the war on terror. And so ever since then, Russia has been attacked. So Trump, coming in naively, now look, Russia did the right thing in Syria by exposing the perfidy of the globalists, the phony war on terror. But Russia's still not our friend. I'm not like Paul Craig Roberts, who thinks that just because the establishment's against Russia, Russia must be good. It isn't good. It was doing the right thing in Syria by exposing the lies of the globalists, but it still intends to strike the West and is now in league with China to build their weapons sufficiently where they can take on the West. That won't happen until at least the middle of the next decade. So that's on track, and in North Korea is their trigger event that they've always designed to start the war. That's why they've allowed the appearance of an unstable Kim family member always to rule North Korea, so that it appears like a crazy man is starting the war and they don't get the blame. But this is a very, very sophisticated long-term agenda. Chinese and Russians look at the long term, not just in 2 to 5 years, but 20 years before they're going to strike, and we're getting close to that time.
Let me ask you, you just mentioned a point, North Korea. It looks from the outset that Kim Jong-un does want to denuclearize the whole Korean peninsula, but at the same time you're saying it's the trigger event. We have the upcoming summit of Trump and North Korea, Kim Jong leader, which he calls Chairman Kim, in Vietnam. I think it's in literally a week's time.
Yeah, it is. Well, look. The highest defector from North Korea said it plainly this week. He said, North Korea is never giving up its nuclear weapons. Trump is being played, and he's right. And you see, Trump has this problem of bragging that I'm going to make a deal and it's going to be a wonderful deal and I'm going to get North Korea to denuclearize. He swore up and down, I'm going to take care of North Korea one way or the other, either diplomatically or a military solution. And he is so bought in to the stroke that he gets from the mainstream media about getting peace with North Korea that he's got blinders on there. He can't see that he's being fooled. Kim is planning on giving up another phony concession to Trump, so that knowing that Trump needs to walk away from the next summit saying, look, I'm brandishing a concession from Kim. It's working. My diplomacy is working. What did he get in the first meeting? He got, remains back of a person who was, tortured in prison, and he ends up dying in the United States. He got back some Japanese abductees. He got the remains of certain people back. But did he get any nuclear weapons given up? No, not at all. But he has taken all that to his constituents and say, look at the success I've done. And then he talked about having a love affair. We fell in love, we trust each other. And Kim is planning on giving up their main plutonium nuclear reactor as a claim. And of course, our intelligence people know that Kim has secret nuclear reactors that are producing most of the plutonium for his weapons now. In fact, this other reactor has reached the end of its lifetime, so it's just a throwaway. But Trump is going to ride this all the way to success. And look what Kim is doing. He's not doing any testing. He's not doing any missiles. He's giving up his nuclear reactor. Well, it's not his only one. Just like he blew up his test site that had already been destroyed by an earthquake. So you blow up the entrance to impress Trump. But it's just a fool's errand, as the defector says. Kim is nothing without nuclear weapons. He's never going to give them up. He does not have an effective conventional military. He can't beat South Korea as is without nuclear weapons, and he's right.
You're absolutely right that if he didn't have any nuclear weapons, he would have no bargaining power. There'd be no reason to really pay attention to that, the Herman Nation. I think really if there were no nuclear weapons in North Korea to begin with, I'm not talking about recently, after the negotiations, just go back 2 years ago, 2 short years ago, Trump was calling him Little Rocket Man and things like that. The only reason is because of the nuclear weapons. If he didn't have them, well, then we might as well just maybe labeled him as another country, like something that has no nuclear weapons and therefore is no threat whatsoever to globally, or let alone to one of our alliance members. Now, what do you think the trigger event's going to be that's going to cause the Chinese and Russians to attack us here on mainland United States?
Well, I think, you see, Russia and China are planning on doing a preemptive nuclear strike on military targets only. They do not want to destroy the American economy or the European economy by hitting cities. You will destroy several cities, in fact, if the military is so intrinsically involved, like Seattle, San Diego, Omaha, Nebraska, Washington, D.C., Norfolk, Virginia, Jacksonville, Florida. Those are dead cities, Colorado Springs, because of the military facilities deep within the city. When you get a nuclear weapon, you'll have a lot of destruction. But that said, they need a trigger event. They don't want to be seen as the aggressors. They want to be seen as responding to Western aggression. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, I want to emphasize this, that the globalists have been intervening around the world to help build the reputation of the bully of the world. And Trump and Xi Jinping are using this for their own people. Look at what the U.S. is doing to us. Look at the U.S. sanctions. Look at this and that. The U.S. is playing the bully with us. And we're the innocent party. And the Russians are lapping it up. They're just really getting anti-American and very nationalistic because of globalist intervention. For example, when we went into Serbia, which we manufactured the crisis and faked the Serbian attack on the Kosovarians, we went and bombed infrastructure in Serbia, not military targets. We bombed TV stations. We bombed electrical power plants. We bombed dams. We bombed bridges. And people in Serbia saying, what are you doing? Bombing civilians. And it's at that point that the Russians and all the Slavic peoples in Eastern Europe began to hate the United States because of what happened in Syria. Israel did the same thing in Lebanon. The last major war in Lebanon, they attacked infrastructure and not military targets to create hatred, against Israel, which is essentially a globalist puppet.
This reminds me of...
Just tell you what the trigger event is. The trigger event is that Trump will not defang North Korea. They're building more nuclear weapons, even though they're not testing. Why should they test them? They've already successfully tested nuclear weapons and the missiles. They just got them in serial production now in secret facilities, and they won't even tell the U.S. what they've got. So Trump will not solve the problem. Sometime further on the line, when they're ready for war, they'll sick Kim Jong-un on South Korea, and they'll have some type of conflict between the South where they'll make demands and the South will refuse, and they'll start a war. And the only way that the U.S. can defend against, million-man army pouring across the border against 13,000 U.S. combat troops or 50,000 South Korean troops is to use tactical nuclear weapons. At that point, Russia and China come out and say, all right, you started this, you used nuclear weapons first, and they use that as an excuse to do a preemptive strike on U.S. military. That's how I think it's going.
And that's a very plausible way to look at it. When you mentioned the civilians being killed in Syria, this brings me back to the 80s when you had the Soviet Union and versus the Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, you had the Mujahideen that were being funded by the CIA. 1988 comes around and they're just dropped. They had no funding for their generations or the people that have survived whose families were killed. Well, then that ushered in a whole new generation of people that are willing to die for the people that were killed. I would imagine the same thing happens with killing civilians. Not only are you creating hatred against yourself, being as a nation across what the globe looks at you as, you're also creating people who are ready to die because you killed their family.
Yeah, and that's why when we intervened in Libya, you know, we supposedly did a no-fly zone, but it wasn't a no-fly zone at all. It was just, you can't fly, but we were sending in rockets and missiles and cruise missiles and special forces and destroying Saddam Hussein's army so that the rebel forces, which we had been funding through, secret covert funding from the CIA, took over the country. It was just a bloodbath. I mean, and we created it. We created that chaos so that we could harvest all of the jihadists that were formed in Tunisia and in Egypt and in Libya, and we sent them to Syria. So you see, you create these revolutions against these Arab, and they were tyrannical. Except for Muammar Gaddafi, he was really the closest thing to a benevolent dictator. And he gave almost all the oil revenue back to his citizens, free education, free health care. Not that I'm a believer in free stuff from government, but he had it with the oil revenues, and he was really using it to enhance his people. And the U.S., couldn't tolerate that. So they set him up for defeat and set that nation up. And it's still in terrible shape today. Iraq is in terrible shape because of what we did to it. It's never fully recovered.
Colonel Gaddafi, I remember, I think probably within a year, maximum 2 years before the Arab Spring, he literally said, if Russia and the U.S. can be friends now, why can't Libya and the U.S. be friends? And then all of a sudden you have him being killed, executed, I believe, with his own golden gun after he was dragged out of the tunnel. I like you said, the closest thing to a benevolent leader. Well, clearly someone who wanted to make things work. And that's the way I perceived it. And yet, boom, he's dead. And clearly, when things like that happen, how it makes you beg. The question is how can the people who live in Libya turn around and kill their own leader by themselves, especially if there was such a stronghold on it? They can't unless they're given weapons and money. And that's when you mentioned the special forces in Libya. I'm pretty sure. I mean, look what happened in Benghazi. And one of the quotes from that movie, 13 Hours, when they were trying to call AFRICOM, and one of these soldiers says, what about home? Is anyone picking up at home? And I thought that was a very fantastic statement because as that was going on, nobody in the State Department was responding. Clearly, whatever was happening in Libya was wanting to be happened here.
That's right. What was really happening in Libya is this depot that was Ambassador Stevens was in charge of was shipping arms that had been captured from and salvaged from all the Libyan army and was sending it to Syria to arm the rebels. And that's one of the reasons why they wanted Stevens killed, and they didn't go in to rescue him because they were afraid that when this whole thing blew up that he would blow the whistle on it and say, the U.S. was sending arms to jihadists in Syria.
I believe
that's why there was a military stand-down order, and Trey Gowdy, even the Republican, betrayed us by he got in his investigation 2 people to admit that there was a stand-down order, and he never asked the question who gave the order. He just let it drop.
Was the order coming from the Secretary of State at the time?
It probably was coming from the National Security Advisor. They're the normal deep state person that always controls a puppet president. Wow. But in any case, Trey Gowdy should have asked who gave the order to stand down. Who did you receive the order to stand down? I mean, it would have been a simple question, and the guy would have had to have answered. He would have known. It was so-and-so from the National Security Council.
Let me ask you, what is going on here? We're talking about what is going on across, literally around the world. that is affecting our interests that we have around the world. But we have a lot of things that are changes that are happening within the United States. One of the articles you wrote was about Oregon to become the first state with mandatory rent control. Is this the first signs of socialism?
Oh, no, they're well into it. I mean, Oregon has had statewide land use control and planning so that you can't do what you want with your own property. They've got, all kinds of laws like California about promoting homosexuality in public schools. So Oregon has always been a bastion of the Democrats. Well, I won't say always. I mean, when I lived there, and I'm from Oregon, it was even Steven, pretty much so. And pretty soon, Portland continued to attract the far left. A lot of people from California moved into the Portland area and turned more and more liberal, and eventually it overwhelmed. Actually, to this day, probably 45% of Oregon is still conservative, but they never win anything because it's all totally controlled by the Willamette Valley, which is full of liberals.
Let me ask you about the House Democrats, the article that you have about gearing up to introduce the first gun control bill of the new Congress. I've always argued that if you have tighter regulations on gun control, that does not affect criminals or anybody who's buying guns illegally on the street. There's a flood of them. And I've always gotten the impression that certain agencies that are corrupt from within want this to happen. If you don't have crime, then that doesn't have a way for you to pay for jails, cops, judges. A lot of people would be out of work if there wasn't crime.
Well, that's not the motivation, though, to keep them in jobs. The motivation, of course, is to disarm America, and that's why we have these active shooter situations so often in the United States, is you have people being provoked into doing those things, and with psychology, with hypnosis, with mood-altering drugs, it's a real problem. And it's the only nation in the world. It isn't because we have guns. It's because, and we do have, pretty strict gun control almost everywhere. It's just like the Aurora shooter. He had a, concealed weapon permit that was revoked because they found out he had a felony. In fact, he had 2 background checks that they didn't catch it until it was caught later on, and they just sent him a letter, you should turn in your gun to the police, and of course he never did. There was no enforcement. So gun control really doesn't work. It doesn't stop criminals and bad acting people from getting guns.
Let me ask you also about another one of our citizens who seemed to have got a slap on the wrist. Epstein. What happened there? What did the federal prosecutors do, and were they finally found out for violating the law?
Well, Acosta is one of those deep state people that Trump put in. I guess he's the Secretary of HUD or something like that in the administration, and he was the prosecutor. He cut a deal with Epstein, basically made him only liable for a few state charges. Got 13 months in prison, for massive habitual sexual abuse, pornography, child trafficking, you name it. He was in there. This guy should be locked up for life.
For life.
And Acosta got him off, and that's a proof that Acosta's deep state. And there's a lot of people involved in Epstein, from Bill Clinton to Donald Trump to other people who went there to his orgies and other things on his Miami place, and flew out to a special island that he had these things. I mean, and I just saw in the news tonight that a judge has now this is very interesting. See, a judge ruled that the prosecutors erred in doing this plea deal with Epstein by not telling the victims. This is a violation of federal law. You have to let the victim know you're doing a plea deal with somebody so that they can protest. They never did that. So what does the judge say? The prosecution is in trouble with the courts because they didn't follow the law, but this will not affect the sentencing or plea deal with Epstein. It remains in force.
Because of the Fifth Amendment, double jeopardy?
No, that's not why they said that. They just said that we won't, the case is not invalid, is the plea deal. The judge could have ruled the plea deal is invalid, okay, because he wasn't really tried. It was a plea deal, Okay, so he could still be tried if the plea deal is ruled invalid. But the judge, and the judges are all deep state controlled, at least most of them. This is clearly one of them, because he says, I have to sanction the prosecution. Acosta, who's not a prosecutor, how can you sanction him? He's a secretary of, in the cabinet of Trump. So you can't slap him in jail. You just say, tap, tap, you guys erred in not telling the victims about this plea deal. But the plea deal stands. He didn't invalidate it, which he should have done. He should have said the plea deal is invalid and he must go to trial now.
Wow, so nothing's going to change. Essentially, he announced that the prosecutors obviously violated the law, but nothing changes. The outcome's still the same.
The outcome's still the same, and Acosta's still free, and he's not going to jail for it. And, it's just like Andrew McCabe, lying and denying that he lied, even though it's proven that he leaked to the Wall Street Journal. On oath, he said, I did not leak, and it's proven that he did, and he'll never see jail time. Whereas and this was material, meaning it was a significant lie that had to do with a direct violation of law, which you cannot leak classified or confidential meetings and the results of those to the press. And it was material, his lie. Roger Stone, for example, is being railroaded because he made a few mistakes in whether or not he talked to them, but it was immaterial. In other words, it was not a substantive issue of breaking of the law. It was just an untruth. And, of course, the only reason Mueller knew that it was untruth, he had NSA transcripts of all Stone's emails and telephone conversations. So when Lindsey Graham says that we're going to pull Mark McCabe before the committee, I'm pointing this out in tomorrow's World Affairs Brief, McCabe will deny it, just like everything else. And Congress does not have access to the NSA transcripts of what goes on in the DOJ and the White House for the Republicans, and so they'll never be able to find out for sure if McCabe is lying or not. But if McCabe were a conservative going before the Mueller investigation, and like they did with Roger Stone, they knew they had the transcripts. So what were they even asking him? What he said to this? They were just setting him up so that he would lie, so that he would make any mistake. They were fishing for it. And as soon as they knew, because you see, this is entrapment. When you already know the answer, you have no business asking someone unless you're trying to get them to perjure themselves. That's the trap they set for Roger Stone and Paul Manafort. And they were stupid enough to not realize that the deep state has access to all NSA spying domestically on everything. But they won't use it against McCabe. They won't use it against Rod Rosenstein.
Even though they're the ones who really technically committed treason by Rosenstein admitting that, whether he admitted or not, maybe you could correct me on this, that he was going to wear, he denied?
Yeah, well, he's denied it, but McCabe, I think, is telling the truth. Even though McCabe is a liar, when he's fingering somebody else to get the pressure off him, I think he's telling the truth. I mean, clearly, if you're going to do a 25th Amendment instability charge against the president, you've got to wear a wire and get him ranting and doing irrational things. That's what they were going to do.
And like you said, obviously the deep state is not arresting any of those other people that were involved in crimes like that. Yet the Mueller probe has not, anybody who's been charged, indicted, or sentenced like Manafort, none of it relates to Russian collusion. Real quick, before we go off air, what's your comment on that real quick, and then anything else you want to comment on?
Well, there is no Russian collusion, and that's why Mueller has used his time simply to go after Trump associates for unrelated immaterial to the investigation crimes. This is something, the Mueller investigation should be limited to the mandate of which it's investigated. It shouldn't have carte blanche. Otherwise, it needs to be confirmed by the Senate. All high-level authorities that have this kind of carte blanche jurisdictional ability in law, like in the Department of Justice, have to be confirmed by the Senate. Mueller's not been confirmed by the Senate, so he should not have this wide-ranging leeway to go after crimes that are not related to the mandate of his special counsel. So he's not going to have anything. He does claim, of course, that we have NSA trappings of them trying to break into the registrar's office, but that doesn't manipulate an election. I mean, in fact, that's as phony as can be. The NSA can falsify any type of digital fingerprint anywhere in the world and say it was Russia. And, we know that the NSA lies when they told Trump that, Assad used chemical weapons on his own people multiple times, which never happened. It was the U.S.-backed rebels that did it, used chemical weapons and blamed it on Assad. So this is the problem. We can't trust anything now the government says.
You're absolutely right on that. And let me comment on what you just mentioned. I learned this actually talking to Jerome Corsi and with his book, Killing the Deep State. There was one thing I was able to contribute through my own research, and that was the CIA's program, Project Umbra. What it has is over 500 of all the nations and their respective intelligence agencies and everything else, their digital fingerprint. Therefore, they can blame it on somebody else, and yet that country has nothing to do with it. And that, I think, is what was used by all these other actors that were involved to try to get Trump not elected, to make sure he wasn't elected, or to get that FISA warrant against Carter Page, blame it on Russia through Project Umbra and having that digital fingerprint. And when I found that out, I gotta say, my mind was blown, because it's like that was the smoking gun. Mr. Skousen, it's always an honor to speak to you. Everybody, please check worldaffairsbrief.com and email editor at worldaffairsbrief.com. You could also access his site via our website, drjradiolive.com. Click on the banner and check out the subscription. That way you can stay on top of the news, because, like I said, that's how I learn my news. Mr. Skousen, any final words for anybody out there listening?
It's really only $1 a week to get my analysis, so it's really economical, $48 a year. So I encourage people to subscribe. You can even get a trial subscription for a month for $5. So encourage people to try that.
Well said. Again, thanks to Joel Skousen, the world affairs expert, political scientist, and world affairs expert for InfoWars, and someone that I like to use. And also the people I want to thank are all you, the listeners, not just here in the United States, but abroad. The people I want to thank behind the scenes is the station owner of UPRN 107.7 FM New Orleans, Joe Montaldo. Also in the United Kingdom, we have JC from Deprogrammed Radio. On my side of the fence, of my team, we have Pam Brettenberg, my social media manager, and my assistant producer, who's also VP of Operations, Josh Cheres. With that being said, folks, I want to thank also iHeartMedia for carrying this show, even though we're probably going against what the mainstream media wants, and that's evident all the time by things that are demonetized or try to be censored. But hey, at least we do have an outlet so far there. With that being said, folks, this is Dr. J, and I am officially signing off.